Chapter 1. One evening at the end of May, a middle-aged man was walking home from Shaston to the village of Marlott in the Vale of Blackmoor. His legs were thin and weak, and he could not walk in a straight line. He had an empty egg basket on his arm, and his hat was old and worn. After a while he passed an elderly parson riding a grey horse.
"Good night,"
said the man with a basket.
"Good night, Sir John," said the parson.
After another step or two, the man stopped and turned round to speak to the parson.
"Now, sir, last market day we met on this road at the same time, and I said good night, and you answered, 'Good night, Sir John,' as you did just now."
"I did," said the parson.
"And once before that, almost a month ago."
"I may have."
"So why do you call me Sir John, when I am only John Durbeyfield?"
The parson rode nearer, and after a moment's hesitation explained. "It was because I've discovered something of historical interest. I am Parson Tringham, the historian. Do you really not know, Durbeyfield, that you are a direct descendant of the ancient and noble family of the d'Urbervilles? They descended from Sir Pagan d'Urberville, who came from Normandy with William the Conqueror in 1066.
"Never heard that before, sir."
"Well, it's true. Let me see your face. Yes, you have the d'Urberville nose and chin. D'Urbervilles have owned land and served their king for hundreds of years. There have been many Sir Johns, and you could have been Sir John yourself."
"Well," exclaimed the man, "and how long has this news about me been known, Parson Tringham?"
"Nobody knows about it at all," said the parson. "I just happened to discover it last spring, when I was trying to find out more about the d'Urbervilles, and noticed your name in the village."
"I've got an old silver spoon, and an old seal too at home," said the man, wondering. "So where do we d'Urbervilles live now, parson?"
"You don't live anywhere. You have died, as a noble family."
"That's bad. So where do we lie?"
"In the churchyard at Kingsbere sub Greenhill."
"And where are our family lands?"
"You haven't any."
John Durbeyfield paused. "And what should I do about it, sir?"
"Oh, nothing. It's a fact of historical interest, nothing more. Good night."
"But you'll come and have some beer with me, Parson Tringham?"
"No, thank you. Not this evening, Durbeyfield. You've had enough already." The parson rode away, half regretting that he had told Durbeyfield of his discovery. Durbeyfield walked on a few steps in a dream, and then sat down with his basket. In a few minutes a boy appeared. Durbeyfield called to him.
"Boy, take this basket. I want you to go and do something for me."
The boy frowned.
"Who are you, John Durbeyfield, to order me about and call me boy? You know my name as well as I know yours." "Do you? That's the secret. Well, Fred, I don't mind telling you that the secret is that I'm one of a noble family."
And Durbeyfield lay back comfortably on the grass.
"Sir John Durbeyfield, that's who I am, and I've got the family seal to prove it."
"Oh?"
"Now take up the basket and tell them in the village to send a horse and carriage to me immediately. Here's a shilling for you."
This made a difference to the boy's view of the situation.
"Yes, Sir John. Thank you, Sir John."
As they spoke, sounds of music came through the evening air from the village.
"What's that?"
said Durbeyfield.
"Have they heard my news already?"
"It's the women dancing, Sir John." The boy went on his way, and Durbeyfield lay waiting in the evening sun. Nobody passed by for a long time, and he could just hear the faint music in the distance. The village of Marlott lies in the beautiful Vale of Blackmoor. Although this valley is only 4 hours away from London, it has not yet been discovered by tourists and artists. The best view of the vale is from the hills surrounding it. It looks like a map spread out. It is a quiet, sheltered part of the countryside, where the fields are always green and the rivers never dry up. To the south lies the great dividing line of hills. From here to the coast, the hills are open, the sun pours down on the huge dry fields, the atmosphere is colourless. But here in the valley lies a completely different countryside, smaller and more delicate. The fields are tiny, the air makes you sleepy, the sky is of the deepest blue. Everywhere you can see a rich greenery of grass and trees, covering smaller hills and valleys. This is the Vale of Blackmoor. And in the village of Marlott, following ancient custom, the young women gathered to dance every holiday. For this May Day dance, all wore white dresses. There was a fine, handsome girl among them, with a red ribbon in her hair. As they danced, they noticed a carriage go by. Durbeyfield lay back in it, singing, "I'm Sir John, and I've got a spoon and seal, and my family lies at Kingsbeer." The girl with the ribbon, who was called Tess, turned red and said quickly to her friends, "Father's tired, that's all." The other girls just laughed, but stopped when Tess looked unhappy. The dancing went on. In the evening, the men of the village came to watch, and later to join the dancers. 3 young strangers who were passing by also stopped to look. They explained they were brothers on a walking tour. The older 2 continued their walk, but the youngest seemed more interested in the girls than his brothers were, and stayed to dance with several of them. As he left the dance, he noticed Tess, who seemed a little sad that he had not chosen her. He looked back from the road, and could still see her in her white dress, standing modestly apart from the dancers. He wished he had danced with her. He wished he had asked her name. But it was too late. He hurried on to join his brothers. The young stranger had made an impression on Tess. But soon, worried by her father's strange appearance that afternoon, she decided to walk home. After the excitement of the dance, her parents' small cottage was a depressing sight. It was dark inside, as they had only 1 candle. The furniture was old and worn. There were 6 children crowded into the tiny space. Their mother was doing the washing, at the same time as putting the baby to sleep. Looking after so many children had aged Joan Durbeyfield, but she still showed some of her early prettiness, which Tess had inherited. "Let me help with the washing, Mother," said Tess gently. "Oh, Tess, I'm glad you've come," said her mother. "There's something I must tell you." "Is it anything to do with Father making such a fool of himself this afternoon?" asked Tess, frowning. "That's all part of the excitement. They've discovered we're the oldest family in the whole county, going back a long way. And our real name is d'Urberville. Doesn't that make you proud? That's why your father rode home in the carriage, not because he'd been drinking, as people thought." "I'm glad of that. Will it do us any good, Mother?" "Oh, yes. Great things may come of it. No doubt our noble relations will be arriving in their carriages as soon as they find out." "Where is Father now?" asked Tess suddenly. Her mother did not answer directly. "He saw the doctor today, you know. It's fat round the heart, he says. That's the cause of his illness. He might last 10 years, might last 10 months, or days." Tess looked anxious. Her father, suddenly a great man, to die so soon. "But where is Father?" she asked firmly. "Now don't you get angry," said Mrs. Durbeyfield. "The poor man was feeling so weak after the news that he went to Rolliver's. He needs to build up his strength to deliver the beehives tomorrow, remember?" "Oh, my God!" cried Tess. "He went to a public house, and you agreed to it, Mother?" "No, I didn't," said Mrs. Durbeyfield crossly. "I've been waiting for you to look after the children while I fetch him." Tess knew that her mother greatly looked forward to these trips to Rolliver's. There she could sit by her husband's side among the beer drinkers and forget that the children existed. It was one of the few bright moments in her hard-working life. Mrs. Durbeyfield went out, and Tess was left with the children. They were very young and totally dependent on the Durbeyfield couple. 6 helpless creatures who had not asked to be born at all, much less to be part of the irresponsible Durbeyfield family. Chapter 2. It was 11 o'clock before all the family were in bed, and 2 o'clock next morning was the latest time to set off with the beehives. It was a distance of 20 or 30 miles on bad roads to Casterbridge, where the Saturday market was held. At 1:30, Mrs. Durbeyfield came into the bedroom where Tess and all the children slept.
"The poor man can't go," she whispered.
Tess sat up in bed.
"But it's late for the bees already. We must take them today."
"Maybe a young man would go?" asked Mrs. Durbeyfield doubtfully.
"One of the ones dancing with you yesterday."
"Oh, no, not for the world," said Tess proudly.
"And let everybody know the reason? I'd be so ashamed. I think I could go, if little Abraham came with me."
Tess and Abraham dressed, led out the old horse Prince with the loaded wagon, and set off in the dark. They cheered themselves up with bread and butter and conversation.
"Tess," said Abraham after a silence.
"Yes, Abraham?"
"Aren't you glad that we're a noble family?"
"Not particularly."
"But you're glad you're going to marry a gentleman?"
"What?" said Tess, lifting her face.
"Our noble relations are going to help you marry a gentleman."
"Me? Our noble relations? We haven't any. Whatever put that into your head?"
"I heard them talking about it at home. There's a rich lady of our family out at Trantridge, and Mother said that if you claimed relationship with her, she'd help you marry a gentleman."
His sister became suddenly silent. Abraham talked on, not noticing her lack of attention.
"Did you say the stars were worlds, Tess?"
"Yes."
"All like ours?"
"They seem like our apples. Most of them good, a few bad."
"Which do we live on, a good one or a bad one?"
"A bad one."
"If we lived on a good one, how would things be different?"
"Well, Father wouldn't be ill and cough as he does, and Mother wouldn't always be washing."
"And you would have been a ready-made rich lady and not have to marry a gentleman."
"Oh, Abby, don't talk of that any more." Abraham finally went to sleep on the wagon. Tess drove the horse. Gradually she fell into a dream. She could see her father, foolish in his pride, and the rich gentleman of her mother's imagination, laughing at the poor Durbeyfield family. Suddenly she awoke from her dream to noise and violent movement. Something terrible had happened. She jumped down and discovered that the post-carriage, speeding along the dark road, had driven into her slow and unlighted wagon. Poor Prince was seriously hurt, and as she watched he fell to the ground.
"You were on the wrong side," said the post-driver. "I must go on with the post, but I'll send somebody to help you as soon as I can. You better stay here with your wagon."
He went on his way, while Tess stood and waited, tears pouring down her cheeks. Daylight came. Prince lay there unmoving, his eyes half open.
"It's all my fault," cried Tess. "What will Mother and Father live on now? Abby, wake up. We can't go on with our beehives. Prince is dead."
When Abby realized what had happened, his face looked like an old man's.
"It's because we live on a bad star, isn't it, Tess?"
he said through his tears. Finally a man arrived with a horse to take the wagon on to Casterbridge to deliver the beehives, and then collect Prince on the way back. When they got home, Tess broke the news to her parents. They were not angry with her, but she blamed herself completely. When Durbeyfield heard he would only get a few shillings for Prince's dead body, he rose to the occasion.
"We d'Urbervilles don't sell our horses for cat's meat," he insisted.
And the following day he worked harder than usual in digging a grave where Prince was buried. All the children cried.
"Has he gone to heaven?" asked Abraham in tears.
But Tess did not cry. Her face was dry and pale. She felt she had murdered a friend. Chapter 3. Life now became rather difficult for the D'Urberfields. Without Prince to carry loads, John D'Urberfield could not buy and sell as he used to. He had never worked hard or regularly, and now he only occasionally felt like working. Tess wondered how she could help her parents. One day her mother made a suggestion.
"It's lucky we found out about your noble blood, Tess. Do you know there's a very rich lady called Mrs. d'Urberville living on the other side of the wood? She must be our relation. You must go to her and claim relationship with her, and ask for some help in our trouble."
"I wouldn't like to do that," said Tess. "If there is such a lady, it would be enough to be friendly. We can't expect help from her."
"You could persuade anybody, my dear. Besides, something else might happen. You never know."
And her mother nodded wisely. "I'd rather try to get work," said Tess sadly.
"What do you say, D'Urberfield?" said his wife, turning to him. "I don't like my children asking for help," said he proudly. "I'm the head of the oldest branch of the family, and a noble family like ours shouldn't have to ask for help."
Tess could not accept his reasons for not going. "Well, as I killed the horse, Mother, I suppose I ought to go. But don't start thinking about her finding a husband for me."
"Who said I had such an idea?" asked Joan innocently.
"I know you, Mother, but I'll go." Next morning Tess walked to Shaston, a town she hardly knew, and went on by wagon to Trantridge. The Vale of Blackmoor was her only world, and she had never been far outside the valley. All the knowledge she had came from her lessons in the village school, which she had left a year or two earlier. As soon as she left school, she had tried to earn a little money by helping in the fields, or milking cows, or making butter. She blamed her mother for thoughtlessly producing so many children. Joan D'Urberfield was like a child herself, and never thought about the future. It was Tess who worried and worked and felt responsible for her little brothers and sisters. So, naturally, it was Tess who should represent her family at the D'Urberville home. From Trantridge she walked up a hill, and turning a corner saw the house. She stopped in amazement. It was large and almost new, a rich red against the green of the bushes around it. Behind it lay the woods called the Chase, an ancient forest. There were greenhouses and well-kept gardens. There was no lack of money here. Tess hesitated, almost frightened. "I thought we were an old family," she said to herself. "But this is all new." She wished she had not come. She was right in a way. All this was owned by the D'Urbervilles, or the Stoke D'Urbervilles, as they called themselves at first. The Stokes were a northern business family, who took an old-sounding name to add to their own when they moved into the south. So Tess was more of a D'Urberville than any of them, but did not know it. A young man appeared in the garden. He looked about 24, and was tall and dark, with full red lips and a black moustache curled at the ends.
"Well, my beauty, what can I do for you?" he said, looking interestedly at her. "I'm Mr. D'Urberville."
It needed all Tess's courage to reply.
"I came to see your mother, sir."
"I'm afraid you can't see her. She's ill. What do you want to see her about?"
It seems so foolish."
"Never mind," said he kindly. "I like foolish things. Try again, my dear." I came, sir, to tell you we are of the same family as you.
Aha! Poor relations?
Yes.
Stokes?
No, d'Urbervilles.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean d'Urbervilles.
We have several proofs that we are d'Urbervilles. We have an old silver spoon and a seal at home, but Mother uses a spoon to stir the soup. Mother said we ought to tell you, as we are the oldest branch of the family, and we've lost our horse in an accident.
Very kind of your mother, said Alec d'Urberville, and I certainly don't regret it. He looked admiringly at Tess, whose face blushed a deep pink. And so you've come on a friendly visit?
I suppose I have,
murmured Tess, looking uncomfortable. Let us walk round the gardens until you have to go home, my pretty cousin. Tess wanted to leave as soon as possible, but the young man insisted. He took her to the greenhouses. Do you like strawberries? He asked.
Yes, said Tess, when they're ready.
These are ready now. And so saying, d'Urberville picked one and held it to her mouth.
No, no, she said. I'd rather take it myself.
But Alec put it into her mouth. He put roses into her hair and filled her basket with strawberries and flowers. He gave her food to eat and watched her while he quietly smoked a cigarette. She looked more adult and womanly than she really was. Alec could not take his eyes off her. She did not know, as she smiled innocently at the flowers, that behind the cigarette smoke was the cause of future sorrow in her life. "What is your name?" asked Alec.
"Tess Durbeyfield. We live at Marlott."
"I must see if my mother can find a place for you." They said good-bye, and she set off home carrying her strawberries and flowers. This, then, was the beginning. Why did she have to meet the wrong man, and one who was so strongly attracted to her? Yet to the right man, she was only a half-forgotten impression from an evening's dancing in a country field. In life, the right man to love hardly ever comes at the right time for loving. Nature does not often answer a call for love until the caller is tired of calling. In this case, as in millions, it was not the two halves of a perfect whole who met. A missing half wandered somewhere else, arriving much later. This delay was to have tragic results. Chapter 4. When Tess arrived home the following afternoon, a letter had already been received by her mother. It appeared to come from Mrs. d'Urberville, and offered Tess work looking after chickens. Joan Durbeyfield was delighted. "It's just a way of getting you there without raising your hopes. She's going to recognize you as family, I'm sure of it."
"I would rather stay here with Father and you," said Tess, looking out of the window.
"But why?"
"I'd rather not tell you, Mother. I don't really know."
A few days later, when Tess came back from looking for work, the children came running out and danced round her. "The gentleman's been here!" they shouted. Joan was full of smiles. Mrs. d'Urberville's son had called and asked if Tess could come or not. "He's a very handsome man," said Mrs. Durbeyfield. "I don't think so," said Tess coldly. "I'll think it over." She left the room. "He's in love with her, you can see that," said Mrs. Durbeyfield to her husband. "No doubt he'll marry her, and she'll be a fine lady." John Durbeyfield had more pride in his new-found blood than energy or health. "That's what young Mr. d'Urberville is trying to do, improve his blood by marrying into the old line." Persuaded by her mother and the children, Tess finally agreed to go. Mrs. Durbeyfield secretly made wedding plans. Then the day came when Tess, wearing her best Sunday clothes on her mother's orders, said goodbye to her family. "Good-bye, my girl," said Sir John, waking from a short sleep. Tell young d'Urberville I'll sell him the title. Yes, sell it at a reasonable price."
"Not for less than £1,000?" cried Lady d'Urberfield.
"No, tell him he can have it for 100. No, 50. No, 20. Yes, £20. That's the lowest. Family honour is family honour, and I won't take any less."
Tess felt like crying, but turned quickly and went out. Her mother went with her to the edge of the village. There she stopped and stood waving goodbye, and watched her daughter walking away into the distance. A wagon came to take her bags, and then a fashionable little carriage appeared. It was driven by a well-dressed young man, smoking a cigar. After a moment's hesitation, Tess stepped in. Joan d'Urberfield, watching, wondered for the first time if she had been right in encouraging Tess to go. That night she said to her husband, "Perhaps I should have found out how the gentleman really feels about her."
"Yes, perhaps you ought,"
murmured John, half asleep. Joan's natural trust in the future came back to her.
"Well, if he doesn't marry her before, he'll marry her after, if she plays her cards right. If he knows about her d'Urberville blood, you mean? No, stupid, if she shows him her pretty face."
Meanwhile, Alec d'Urberville was whipping his horse and driving the carriage faster and faster downhill. The trees rushed past at great speed. Tess was feeling thoroughly frightened. He took no notice when she asked him to slow down. She cried out and held on to his arm in fear.
"Don't touch my arm! Hold on to my waist!" he shouted.
At the top of another hill he said, laughing,
"Put your arms around me again, my beauty."
"Never!" said Tess independently.
"Let me give you one little kiss, Tess, and I'll stop."
"Will nothing else do?" cried Tess in despair.
"Oh, very well."
As they raced on, he was on the point of kissing her, when she suddenly moved aside so that he almost fell off.
"I'll break both our necks!"
he swore passionately.
"I thought you would be kind to me,"
said Tess, her eyes filling with tears.
"I don't want to kiss anybody."
But he insisted, so in the end she sat still, and d'Urberville kissed her. No sooner had he done so than she wiped the place on her cheek with her handkerchief. Just then her hat blew off into the road, and d'Urberville stopped the horse. Tess jumped down to get it, then turned triumphantly to Alec. "I shall walk from here," she said firmly.
"But it's 5 or 6 miles more."
"I don't care."
"You made that hat blow off on purpose. You did, didn't you?"
She was silent. He swore angrily at her.
"Don't use such bad words,"
cried Tess.
"I shall go back to Mother. I hate you."
D'Urberville suddenly started laughing.
"Look, I promise never to do that again," he said. "Come, let me take you in the carriage."
But she refused and began to walk in the direction of Trantridge. So they progressed slowly, d'Urberville driving the carriage beside Tess. Chapter 5. The chickens, for which Tess was responsible, lived in an old cottage on Mrs. d'Urberville's land. On her first day, Tess had to take some of the chickens to show to their owner. She immediately realized the old lady was blind. Mrs. d'Urberville held each bird and felt it carefully to see that it was in good health. At the end, she suddenly asked Tess a question.
"Can you whistle?"
"Whistle, ma'am?" "Yes, whistle tunes. I want you to practice and whistle to my birds every day." "Yes, ma'am." Tess was not surprised at Mrs. d'Urberville's cold manner, and did not expect any more of such a great lady. However, she did not realize that the old lady had never even heard about the family connection. Tess began to enjoy her new work with the chickens, and the next day in the cottage garden she decided to practice whistling as instructed. She was shocked to find that she had completely forgotten how to whistle. Suddenly she noticed a movement behind a tree near the wall. It was Alec d'Urberville. "Well, Cousin Tess," he said, "I've never seen such a beautiful thing as you. I've been watching you from over the wall. Look, I can give you a lesson or two."
"Oh, no, you won't," cried Tess, going back towards the door.
"Don't worry, I won't touch you. Just look." And he showed her how to whistle. From that moment Tess found she could whistle tunes to the birds, just as Mrs. d'Urberville wanted. And as the weeks passed, she often met d'Urberville in the garden, and began to lose her shyness of him. Every Saturday night, the other farm workers from the surrounding area used to go to drink and dance in the market town 2 or 3 miles away. On Sundays they would sleep late. For a long time Tess did not go with them, but after a while she wanted a change from her routine and began to go on the weekly trips regularly. She always came home with the others at night, preferring the protection of being in a group. One Saturday night she was in the town looking for her companions, as it was time to go home, when she met Alec d'Urberville. "What, my beauty? Here so late?" he said, smiling at her. "I'm just waiting for my friends," she answered. "I'll see you again," he said as she moved away. She became worried when she realized the workers were still dancing wildly and would not be going home soon. Again she caught sight of Alec waiting in a doorway, his cigar glowing red in the dark. Eventually she joined a group wandering home. They had all been drinking, but she felt safer with them than alone. But after a while she became involved in a quarrel with them, and was trying to get away from the angry group when Alec d'Urberville rode by. He offered to take her home on the back of his horse. She hesitated, then accepted. Together they rode along in the dark, Tess holding on to Alec. She was very tired. Every day that week she had got up at 5. So she did not notice that they were riding off the main road and into the Chase, the oldest wood in England. It began to get foggy, and finally Alec admitted honestly that he was lost. "Put me down here, sir," cried Tess at once. "Let me walk home from here. How wrong of you to bring me away from the main road. I knew I shouldn't trust you." "Don't worry, my beauty," laughed Alec. "I thought you would enjoy a longer ride on such a lovely night. But I can't let you go. The fog is so bad now that you couldn't possibly find your way. I'll leave you here and go to find out where we are. When I come back, I'll tell you, and you can come with me on horseback or go alone on foot, just as you like." She agreed to this. "Shall I hold the horse?" she asked. "No, he'll stay quiet," answered Alec. "By the way, your father has a new horse today, and the children have some new toys." Was it you who gave them?" "Oh, how good of you," murmured Tess with a heavy heart. "I almost wish you hadn't." "Tessie, don't you love me just a little now?" "I'm grateful," she admitted, "but I'm afraid I don't—" And slowly she started to cry. "Now don't cry, my dear. Sit here and wait for me." He made a bed for the tired girl among the dead leaves and covered her with his coat. He set off into the fog to find out where he was, and came back to find Tess fast asleep. He saw her in her white dress among the leaves, a pale shining figure in the dark. He bent down and touched her cheek with his. Everywhere there was darkness and silence. The birds and animals slept, safe in and under the trees. But who was looking after Tess? Who was protecting her innocence? "Tess," said d'Urberville, and lay down beside her. The girl was not strong enough to resist him. Why was Tess's girlish purity lost? Why does the wrong man take the wrong woman? Why do the bad so often ruin the good? Why is beauty damaged by ugliness? Thousands of years of philosophy cannot give us the answers to these questions. These things happen and have always happened.
Perhaps in the past, rolling home after a battle, Tess's ancestors, the real d'Urbervilles, had done the same, even more cruelly, to young country girls. But we cannot accept that that is Tess's fault, and should happen to her. As the people of her village say, it was to be. And from now on, Tess's life was to be completely different.
No more.
Chapter 6. It was a Sunday morning in late October, about 4 months after Tess's arrival at Trantridge, and a few weeks after the night ride in the chase. Carrying a heavy basket and bundle, Tess was walking towards the hills which divided her from the Vale, her place of birth. The scenery and people on this side were very different from those in her village. Marlott people mainly thought and travelled northward and westward, while on this side people were interested in the east and the south. She walked up the same hill which d'Urberville had driven down so wildly that June day. On reaching the top of the hill, Tess paused and looked for a long time at the familiar green world of home. It was always beautiful from here, but since she had last seen it, her view of life had changed. She had learnt that wickedness exists, even where there is beauty, and now she could hardly bear to look down into the vale. Then she looked behind her and saw a carriage coming up the same hill that she had just climbed, with a man leading the horse. Soon he caught up with her. "Why did you slip away in secret like that?" asked d'Urberville breathlessly. "I've been driving like mad to catch up with you. Just look at my horse. You know nobody would have prevented you from going. I'm going to drive you the rest of the way, if you won't come back with me." "I won't come back," she said quietly. "I thought so. Well, let me help you up. Give me your basket." She stepped up into the carriage and sat beside him. She had no fear of him now. The reason for this was also the reason for her sorrow. They drove along, d'Urberville making conversation, and Tess thinking her own thoughts. When they approached the village of Marlott, a tear rolled down her cheek. "Why are you crying?" he asked coldly. "I was only thinking I was born over there." "Well, we must all be born somewhere." "I wish I'd never been born, there or anywhere else," she said quietly. "Well, you shouldn't have come to Trantridge if you didn't want to. You didn't come for love of me, anyway." "That's quite true. If I had ever loved you, if I loved you still, I could not hate myself for my weakness as much as I do now." He did not look at her. She added, "I didn't understand your intention until it was too late." "That's what every woman says." "How dare you say that?" she cried angrily, her eyes flashing at him. "My God, I could hit you! Do you never think that some women may not only say, but feel it?" "All right," he said, laughing. "I'm sorry to hurt you. I did wrong, I admit it. Only don't keep accusing me. I'm ready to pay for it. You need never work on the farms again." Her lip lifted slightly as she replied, "I will not take anything from you. I cannot." "One would think you were a queen as well as being one of the real d'Urbervilles. Well, Tess dear, I suppose I'm a bad sort of man. I've always been one, and I always will be one. But I promise I won't be bad to you again. And if anything should happen, you understand, if you are in any trouble or need anything, just drop me a line and I'll send by return whatever you want." She stepped down from the carriage and was going to leave him when he stopped her and said, "You're not going to turn away from me like that, dear. Come, let me kiss you." "If you wish," she answered coldly. She offered her cool cheek to him, but her eyes rested on a distant tree, as if the kiss had nothing to do with her. "You don't give me your lips, Tess. I'm afraid you'll never love me." "It's true. I have never loved you, and I never can." She added sadly, "Perhaps I should tell a lie.
and then I could lead a comfortable life. But I have enough honour not to tell that lie. If I loved you, I might have a very good reason to tell you so. But I don't." Alec sighed heavily, as if the scene were depressing him. "Well, you're very sad, Tess, and you have no reason to be. You're still the prettiest girl for miles around. Will you come back with me? Say you will." "Never, never. I've made up my mind and I won't come." "Then goodbye." And Alec jumped up into his carriage and drove off. Tess did not watch him go, but continued her walk alone. It was still early in the day, and the sun was not yet giving any warmth. Tess felt even sadder than the autumn sadness which surrounded her. But soon a man came up behind her, a man with a pot of red paint in his hand. "Good morning," he said, and offered to carry her basket. "You're up early on a Sunday?" he continued. "Yes," said Tess. "A day of rest for most people, although I do more real work today than in the rest of the week put together." "Do you?" "In the week I work for man, but on Sunday I work for God. That's better work, don't you think? Wait a moment. I have something to do here." He stopped at a gate, and in large red letters on the middle bar of the gate he painted some words from the Bible. "Punishment awaits you." In the soft air, against the gentle green of the trees and the peaceful fields, these great red words stared at Tess. They pointed a finger at her. This man was a stranger, and could not know her story, but the words accused her. "Do you believe what you paint?" she asked in a low voice. "Do I believe those words? Do I believe I am alive?" "But," she whispered, trembling, "suppose you were forced to do wrong?" He shook his head. "I can't answer that question. I paint the words and leave others to think about them in their own hearts." "I think they're horrible words," cried Tess. "I'll take my basket and go now." And she walked away from him, her heart beating fast. "I don't believe God said those things," she thought as she reached her village. There was smoke coming from her father's chimney, but seeing the inside of the cottage made her heart ache. It was as poor as ever. Her mother jumped up, surprised to see her. "Well, my dear Tess," she said, kissing her, "how are you? Have you come home to be married?" "No, not for that, Mother." "What? Isn't your cousin going to marry you?" "He's not my cousin, and he's not going to marry me." Her mother looked at her closely. "Come, you haven't told me everything." Then Tess went up to her mother, put her head on Joan's shoulder, and told her the whole story. "And you haven't persuaded him to marry you?" cried Joan. "What's the good of going there? Why didn't you think of doing some good for your family, instead of thinking only of yourself?" Tess was confused. Alec had never mentioned marriage to her. But even if he had, she would never have accepted him, because she did not love him. This made her hate herself for what she had done. She would certainly never love him in the future. She did not quite hate him, but did not wish to marry him, even to remain respectable. "You ought to have been more careful if you didn't want to marry him." "Oh, Mother!" cried the poor girl, her heart breaking. "Why didn't you warn me about men? I was a child when I left home. I didn't know how dangerous they can be, and you didn't tell me." "Well, we must make the best of it," said her mother. "It's only human nature, after all." That afternoon, the little cottage was full of Tess's friends, girls who lived in the village and who had missed her while she had been away. They whispered to each other that Tess was sure to marry that handsome gentleman. Fortunately, Tess did not hear them. She joined in their laughing and talking, and for a short time almost forgot her shame. But the next day was Monday, the beginning of the working week,
when there were no best clothes and no visitors. She awoke with the innocent children asleep around her, she who had lost her innocence. She looked into her future and grew very depressed. She knew she had to travel on a long, stony road, without help or sympathy. She had nothing to look forward to, and she wanted to die. In the next few weeks, however, she became more cheerful, and went to church one Sunday morning. She loved listening to the well-known tunes, and gave herself up to the beauty of the music. She wondered at the composer's power. From the grave he could make a girl like her, who had never known him, feel extremes of emotion. She sat in a quiet, dark corner listening to the service. But when the village people arrived at church, they noticed her and started whispering to each other. She knew what they were saying, and realized she could come to church no more. So she spent almost all her time in her bedroom, which she shared with the children. From here she watched the wind, the snow, the rain, beautiful sunsets and full moons, one after another. People began to think she had gone away. She only went out after dark to walk in the woods and the fields. She was not afraid of the dark or the shadows. It was people she was anxious to avoid. She was at home on the lonely hills, but she felt guilty surrounded by innocent nature. When it rained, she thought nature was crying at her weakness, and when the midnight wind blew, she thought nature was angry with her. But she did not realize that although she had broken an accepted social rule, she had done nothing against nature. She was as innocent as the sleeping birds in the trees, or the small field animals in the hedges. Chapter 7. One day in August, the sun was rising through the mist. In a yellow cornfield near Marlott village, it shone on 2 large arms of painted wood. These, with 2 others below, formed the turning cross of the reaping machine. It was ready for today's harvest. A group of men and a group of women came down the road at sunrise. As they walked along, their heads were in the sun, while their feet were in the shadow of the hedge. They went into the field. Soon there came a sound like the love-making of the grasshopper. The machine had begun, and 3 horses pulled it slowly along the field. Its arms turned bright in the sunlight. Gradually the area of standing corn was reduced. So was the living space of the small field animals, who crowded together, not knowing that they could not escape the machine in the end. The harvesters followed the machine, picking and tying up bundles of corn. The girls were perhaps more interesting to look at. They wore large cotton hats to keep off the sun, and gloves to protect their hands from the corn. The prettiest was the one in the pale pink jacket, who never looked around her as she worked. She moved forward, bending and tying like a machine. Occasionally she stood up to rest. Then her face could be seen, a lovely young face, with deep dark eyes and long, heavy curling hair. Her cheeks were paler, her teeth more regular, and her red lips thinner than most country girls. It was Tess Durbeyfield, or d'Urberville, rather changed, living as a stranger in her home village. She had decided to do outdoor work and earn a little money in the harvest. The work continued all morning, and Tess began to glance towards the hill. At 11 o'clock, a group of children came over the hill. Tess blushed a little, but still did not pause in her work. The eldest child carried in her arms a baby in long clothes. Another brought some lunch. The harvesters stopped work, sat down and started to eat and drink. Tess also sat down, some way from the others. She called the girl, her sister, and took the baby from her. Unfastening her dress, and still blushing, she began feeding her child. The men kindly turned away, some of them beginning to smoke. All the other women started to talk and rearrange their hair. When the baby had finished, Tess played with him without showing much enthusiasm.
Then suddenly she kissed him again and again, as if she could not stop. The baby cried out at the violence of her kisses.
"She loves that child, though she says she hates him and wishes they were both dead," said one of the women, watching the young mother. "She'll soon stop saying that," replied another. "She'll get used to it. It happens to lots of girls."
"Well, it wasn't her fault. She was forced into it that night in the chase. People heard her sobbing. A certain gentleman might have been punished if somebody had passed by and seen them. It was a pity it happened to her, the prettiest in the village. But that's how it happens.
The ugly ones are as safe as houses, aren't they, Jenny?" And the speaker turned to one who was certainly not beautiful. Tess sat there unaware of their conversation. Her mouth was like a flower, and her eyes were large and soft, sometimes black, blue, or grey, sometimes all three colours together. She had spent months regretting her experience and crying over it, but suddenly decided that the past was the past. In a few years her shame and she herself would be forgotten. Meanwhile the trees were just as green, and the sun shone just as brightly as before. Life went on. She most feared what people thought of her, and imagined that they talked constantly about her behind her back. In fact, she was not often discussed, and even her friends only thought about her occasionally. Other things of more importance took up their time. If there had been no people around her, Tess would not have made herself so unhappy. She would have accepted the situation as it was. She was miserable, not because she felt unhappy, but because she imagined herself rejected by society. Now she wanted to be useful again and to work. So she dressed neatly and helped in the harvest and looked people calmly in the face, even when holding her baby in her arms. Having eaten her lunch quickly, Tess went back to work with the harvesters in the cornfield until it was dark. They all came home on one of the largest wagons, singing and laughing together. But when Tess reached home, she discovered that the baby had fallen ill that afternoon. He was so small and weak that illness was to be expected, but this still came as a shock to Tess. She forgot the shame surrounding his birth, and only wished passionately to keep him alive. However, it became clear that he was dying. Now Tess had a greater problem. Her baby had not been baptized. Her ideas on religion were not very developed. She had more or less accepted that she would go to hell for her crime, and did not much care what would happen to her after death. But for her baby it was different. He was dying and must be saved from hell. It was nearly bedtime, but she rushed downstairs and asked if she could send for the parson. Her father had just returned from the public house, and was at his most sensitive to the shame brought upon his noble name by Tess. He refused to allow the parson in and locked the door. The family went to sleep. As the night passed, Tess realized in great misery that the baby was close to death. She walked feverishly up and down the room, until an idea came to her. Perhaps baby can be saved. Perhaps it will be just the same. She lit a candle and woke her young brothers and sisters. Having poured some water into a bowl, she made them kneel around, with their hands together as in church. The children were hardly awake, and watched Tess with big round eyes. She looked tall in her long white nightdress, her long dark hair hanging down her back to her waist. Her enthusiasm lit up her face, giving it a beautiful purity, the face which had caused her shame. She picked up the baby. One of the children asked, "Are you really going to baptize him, Tess? What's his name going to be?" She had not thought of that, but remembered the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible. Because they did wrong together, God said they would live in sorrow for the rest of their lives. She said firmly, "Sorrow, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." She splashed some water on the child, and there was silence. "Say amen, children," Amen, they replied. Tess put her hand into the water and drew a huge cross upon the baby with her finger. She continued the service in the well-known words, asking for the baby to be protected against the world and against wickedness. Her belief gave her hope. Her sweet, warm voice rang out the thanks that follow the baptism. The single candle was reflected in her shining eyes like a diamond. The children asked no more questions, but looked up at her in amazement. She seemed almost like a god to them. Poor Sorrow's fight against the world and wickedness was a short one, fortunately, perhaps, taking into account his situation. In the blue light of the morning he breathed his last. Tess had been calm since the baptism, and she remained calm. She was no longer worried about Sorrow's afterlife. If God did not accept the baptism, she did not value his heaven, either for herself or for her child. Tess thought a good deal about the baptism, however, and wondered if it might mean that Sorrow could be buried in the churchyard, with a church service. She went to the parson's house after dark, and met him near his gate. "I should like to ask you something, sir. My baby was very ill, and I wanted you to baptize him, but my father refused to allow it. So I baptized him myself. Now, sir, can you tell me this?" And she looked him straight in the eyes. "Will it be just the same for him, as if you had baptized him?" The parson wanted to say no. She had done what should have been his job. But the girl's strong feeling impressed him. The man and the parson fought inside him, and the man won. "My dear girl," he said, "it will be just the same." "Then will you bury him in the churchyard?" she asked quickly. The parson felt trapped. It was a difficult question to answer. "Ah, that's a different matter," he said. "I'm sorry. I cannot." "Oh, sir?" She took his hand as she spoke. He took it away, shaking his head. "Then I'll never come to church again," she cried. "But perhaps it will be the same for him. Tell me, have pity on me, poor me. Tell me what you really think." The parson was deeply touched by her emotion. For a surprising moment he forgot the strict rules of his church. "It will be just the same," he answered kindly. So the baby was carried in a cheap wooden box to the churchyard at night. There is a corner of the churchyard where the grass grows long, and where the suicides, drunks, unbaptized babies, and other supposed criminals are laid. Sorrow was buried here, at the cost of a shilling and a pint of beer for the gravedigger. Tess bravely made a little cross and put it at the head of the grave one evening, when she could enter the churchyard without being seen. It is all very well saying that we learn from experience. Tess had certainly learnt from experience, but could not see how to use her knowledge, so painfully gained. So she stayed in her parents' home during the winter, helping to look after the children, making clothes for them, and earning a little money whenever she could. Important dates came round again. The night of her shame and the chase, the baby's birth and death, her own birthday. One day, when she was looking at her pretty face in the mirror, she thought of another date, even more important, her own death. When it came, it would swallow up all her prettiness and everything that had happened to her. When was it? It was a day lying hidden among all the other days of the year, so that she noticed nothing when it came round, and did not know what week, month, season, or year it would be. In a flash, Tess changed from simple girl to complicated woman. Her face was often thoughtful, and there was sometimes a tragic note in her voice. Her eyes grew larger and more expressive. She became a beautiful woman. She had suffered, but had gained a certain self-confidence from her experiences. Although the village people had almost forgotten her trouble, she decided she could never be really happy in Marlott. Trying to claim relationship with the rich d'Urbervilles seemed so foolish and shameful to her. She thought her family would never be respected there again. Even now she felt hope rise within her, hope of finding a place with no family connections and no memories. In escaping from Marlott, she intended to destroy the past. Perhaps now she could make up for her crime against society. Consequently, she looked hard for work away from Marlott. She finally heard that a dairyman, some miles to the south, needed a good milkmaid for the summer. Having decided to go there, she promised herself there would be no more hopeless dreams. She would simply be the dairymaid Tess, and nothing more. Even her mother no longer talked about their connection with the noble d'Urbervilles. But in spite of Tess's decision to forget her ancestors, the dairy, called Talbothays, especially attracted her, because it was near the former lands of the old d'Urberville family. She would be able to look at them, and not only observe that the noble d'Urberville family had lost its greatness, but also remember that a poor descendant had lost her innocence. She wondered if some good might come of being in the land of her ancestors. Hope and youthful energy rose up in her again, like leaves on a young tree in spring.
A new life.
Chapter 8. And so it was that on a beautiful morning in May, 2 to 3 years after her return from Trantridge, Tess Durbeyfield left home for the second time. She was going in the opposite direction this time. When she reached the first hill, she looked back at Marlott and her father's house with sadness in her heart. She travelled partly by carriage and partly on foot, carrying her basket. Not far to her left she could see the trees which surrounded Kingsbere, with its church where her ancestors lay in their tombs. She could no longer admire or respect them. She almost hated them for ruining her life. Nothing of theirs was left except the old seal and spoon. "Huh, I have as much of mother as father in me," she said. "All my prettiness comes from her, and she was only a dairymaid." Her walk took 2 hours, until she reached the hill overlooking the valley of the great dairies. This valley was watered by the river Froom, and produced huge amounts of milk and butter, more even than Tess's Vale of Blackmoor, which was known as the Vale of Little Dairies. As she stood and looked, she realized the valleys were quite different. Here the fields and farms were much larger. She saw more cows at a glance than she had ever seen before. The evening sun shone on their red, white and brown bodies. She thought that this view was perhaps not as beautiful as the view of Blackmoor Vale, which she knew so well. There the sky was deep blue. The smell of the earth was heavy in the air. The streams ran slowly and silently. But this view was more cheerful. Here the air was clear and light, and the river Froom rushed as fast as the shadow of a cloud. Either the change in the quality of the air, or the feeling that she was going to start a new life here, made her feel much happier. She ran along, her hopes and the sunshine warming her. She looked at her best as she ran, laughing into the warm wind. The desire for pleasure, which is in every living thing, had finally won over Tess. She was, after all, only a young woman of 20, who had not finished growing up. No event, however unpleasant, could have marked her forever. She was young and strong and beautiful, and could not remain sad for long. Her hopes rose higher than ever. She wanted to show how grateful she was for this second chance. She started singing love songs, but found they were not enough to express her feelings. She remembered the Sunday mornings of her girlhood and sang, "O sun and moon, O stars, O children of men, praise the Lord, praise him forever," until she stopped suddenly and murmured, "But perhaps I don't quite know the Lord yet." This was probably a pagan feeling in a religious form. People who live in the country and are close to nature, like Tess, keep many of the pagan ideas of their ancestors in their souls. Religion learned in church comes much later and does not touch them deeply. Tess was happy to be making her way independently in life. She really wanted to live honestly and work hard, unlike her father. Tess had her mother's energy, and the energy of her youth to help her recover from her experience. Women do usually live through such experiences. Where there's life, there's hope, is still true for most betrayed women. As Tess, full of enthusiasm, came downhill towards the dairy, she suddenly heard the milking call again and again from all parts of the valley. It was 4:30 when the dairy people brought in the cows. Tess followed the red and white animals, with their great bags of milk under them, into the farmyard. She saw the long sheds and the wooden posts shining and smooth where the cows had rubbed against them over the years. She saw the cows between the posts, the sun throwing their shadows on the wall as carefully as a painter paints a beautiful king or queen. As the cows waited for their turn, the milk fell in drops on the ground. The dairymaids and men had come from their cottages as they saw the cows arriving from the fields. Each girl sat on her three-legged stool as she milked, her right cheek resting on the cow's body, watching Tess arrive. The men milked with their hats low over their eyes and did not see her. One of them was a middle-aged man, the head dairyman she was looking for. He worked 6 days a week in his white milking clothes, milking and butter-making, and on the 7th he wore his best suit to take his family proudly to church. Because of this, people nearby used to say, "Dairyman Dick, all the week. On Sundays, Mr. Richard Crick." Most dairymen are usually bad-tempered at milking time, but Mr. Crick was glad to get a new dairymaid at this busy time of the year. So he received Tess warmly and asked her how her family were. "When I was a boy, I knew your part of the country very well," he said. "An old woman of 90, she's dead now, but she used to live near here. She once told me there was an ancient noble family of a name like yours who came from here originally, but I didn't take any notice of an old woman like that." "Oh, no, that's just a story," said Tess. Then Mr. Crick turned to business. "You can milk well, my girl. I don't want my cows drying up, especially just now." "Oh, yes, I can," answered Tess. He looked at her delicate hands and pale face. "Quite sure you're strong enough for this sort of life? It's comfortable enough here for rough country people, but it's hard work." "Oh, yes, I'm strong enough. I'm used to hard work," Tess insisted. "Well, have some tea and something to eat. You've had a long journey," he said kindly. "No, I'd rather begin milking straight away," said Tess. "I'll just drink a little milk first." This surprised Dairyman Crick, who appeared never to have thought of milk as a drink. "Oh, if you can swallow it, have some," he said, holding the bucket for her to drink from. "I haven't touched any for years. It would lie in my stomach like a stone, so it would. Now, try that one and see how you get on." And he pointed to the nearest cow. As soon as Tess was on her stool under the cow, and the milk was pouring between her fingers into the bucket, she really felt that her new life was beginning. As she relaxed, she looked around her. It was a large dairy. There were nearly 100 milking cows. Dairyman Crick milked 6 or 8 of the difficult ones with his own hands. He could not trust them to the dairymaids, because if the cows were badly milked, their milk would simply dry up. For a while, there was no more talk among the milkers. Suddenly Mr. Crick got up from his stool. "We're not getting as much milk from them as usual," he said. "We better sing them a song, friends. That's the only thing to do." So the group of milkers started singing, to encourage the cows to give more. Mr. Crick went on, "But I think bulls like music better than cows."
Did I tell you all about William Dewey? On his way home after a wedding, he found himself in a field with an angry bull. He took his violin and played some Christmas church music, and down went the bull on his knees, just like the animals around baby Jesus, and so William was able to escape. It's a curious story. Takes us back to the past, when belief in God was a living thing. This unusual remark came from under a cow. "Well, it's quite true, sir, believe it or not. I knew the man well," said Mr. Crick. "Oh, yes, I'm sure it's true," said the man behind the brown cow. Tess could not see his face, and could not understand why the head dairyman himself should call him sir. The man stayed under the cow long enough to milk 3, at times saying something angrily to himself. Then he stood up, stretching his arms. Tess could now see him clearly. He wore the clothes of a dairyman, but underneath he was quite different. He looked educated and gentlemanly. But now she realized that she had seen him before. He was one of the 3 walking brothers who had stopped their walk to admire the May Day dance in Marlott a few years before. He had danced with some of the other girls, but not with her. He had not noticed her, and had gone on his way. For a moment she was worried that if he recognized her, he might discover her story. But she soon saw he did not remember her at all. Since she had seen him in Marlott, his face had grown more thoughtful. He now had a young man's moustache and beard. From the time he had spent milking 1 cow, he was clearly a beginner at dairy work. Tess discovered that only 2 or 3 of the dairymaids slept in the house besides herself. They all shared a big bedroom near the cheese room. That night one of the girls insisted on telling Tess about all the people at the dairy. To Tess, half asleep, the whispers seemed to be floating in the air. "Mr. Angel Clare. He's the one who's learning milking. He's a parson's son and thinks a lot and doesn't notice girls. His father is parson at Emminster, some way from here. His sons, except Mr. Clare, are going to be parsons too." Tess gradually fell asleep. Chapter 9. Neither Angel Clare nor his family had originally chosen farming as a profession for him. When he was a boy, people admired his great qualities. Now he was a man, something vague and undecided in his look showed that he had no particular purpose in life. He was the youngest son of a poor parson. One day when he was studying at home, his father discovered that Angel had ordered a book of philosophy, which questioned the church's teaching. How could his son become a priest if he read such books? Angel explained that he did not in fact wish to enter the church like his brothers, because the church's views were too strict and did not allow free thinking. The simple parson was shocked. He was a man of fixed ideas and a firm believer. And if Angel did not want to become a priest, what was the use of sending him to study at Cambridge? For the parson, the whole point of going to university was to become a minister of God. "I want to use my mind," Angel insisted. "I want to read philosophy. I want to question my belief, so that what is left after I have questioned it will be even stronger." "But Angel, your mother and I have saved and saved to send you to university like your brothers. But how can we send you there if it is not in the service of God?" So Angel did not have the advantage of a university education. After some years studying at home, he decided to learn farming. He thought this kind of work could give him what he most valued, independence and freedom to think. So he came to Talbot Hayes at 26 as a student. At first he stayed up in his room most of the time in the evenings, reading and playing his harp. But he soon preferred to read human nature by taking his meals in the general dining room with the dairy people. The longer he stayed, the more Clare liked living with these simple country people. No longer did he see them as lacking in intelligence. He realized they were no different from him.
He and they were all people walking on the dusty road which ends in death. He began to like working outside. He was learning about nature and about life. He came to know the changing seasons, morning and evening, different winds, waters and mists, shade and silence, and the voices of nature. All this he had never known before. For several days after Tess's arrival, Claire, sitting reading a book, hardly noticed she was there. But one morning at breakfast, he was reading music and listening to the tune in his head, when he heard a musical voice which seemed to become part of his tune. He looked round at Tess, seated at the table. "What a fresh and pure daughter of nature that dairymaid is," thought Angel. He seemed to remember something about her, something which took him back into a happy past, before decision made his life difficult. This memory made him look more often at Tess than the other dairymaids. Dairyman Crick insisted that all the dairy people should milk different cows every day, not just their favourites. He was worried that a dairymaid might leave the dairy, and then her cows would not like being milked by a stranger. However, Tess began to find that the cows which came to her usually happened to be her favourites. This made her milking much easier, but she soon realised that it was not by chance, as it was Angel Clare who sent the cows in for milking. "Mr. Clare, you have sent me my favourite cows," she accused him one morning, blushing. "Well, it doesn't matter," said he. "You will always be here to milk them." "Do you think so? I hope I shall, but I don't know." Afterwards she was angry with herself. She had spoken too seriously to him, as if he were involved in her staying or leaving. In the evening, after milking, she walked in the garden alone, thinking about it. It was a typical summer evening in June. The air was delicate, and there was a complete, absolute silence. It was broken by the sound of a harp. The notes floated in the still air, strong and clear. Tess listened like a fascinated bird. She drew near to Claire, who still had not seen her. She was conscious of neither time nor space. The tune moved through her mind and body, bringing tears to her eyes. The waves of colour of the wild flowers mixed with the waves of sound. Angel finished playing and caught sight of her. She blushed and moved away. "Why are you going, Tess?" he asked. "Are you afraid?" "Oh, no, sir. Not of outdoor things." "But indoors?" "Well, yes, sir." "Life in general?" "Yes, sir." "Ah, so am I. Very often. Being alive is rather serious. Don't you think so?" "It is, now you put it like that." "All the same, I wouldn't expect a young girl like you to feel that." "Why? Come, tell me." After a moment's hesitation, she answered. "The trees ask questions with their eyes, don't they? And you seem to see hundreds of tomorrows, all in a line, the first big and clear, the others getting smaller, but they all look fierce and cruel. But you can drive away all these ideas with your music, sir."